The relationship with China is important for any country, just given the size of its economy, perhaps even the size of its landmass. You've suggested that Prime Minister Trudeau may be naive in his approach. Why?
I suggested that, Alison, because I think of China as representing sort of the portal, the entry point for a new kind of foreign policy for Canada. A foreign policy in which we have to work out our future with countries that are unlike us, and in some respects, at times, unlikable. They're difficult countries, they're countries that have their own internal problems, but they're important countries. We're used to working out our future alongside the United States, which can be frustrating and hard to understand, even these days. But by and large, we're a lot closer to the United States in terms of outlook and worldview. China is an entirely new phenomenon. There's a Canadian fascination with China, and I think the Prime Minister feels that. And there's also been a tendency by the two Canadian parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, to see China differently. For the Liberals, it's been a romance with a country that really represents a golden future. And for the Conservatives, it's a little bit more concern, fear of a country that may represent a real challenge. The reality is China's both.
Right.
And I think just as Prime Minister Harper was very cool to China and probably too cool, it's also possible to be too warm and too optimistic. So when the Prime Minister talked about China being the country he most admired and talking with some degree of admiration for how the Communist Party and its dictatorship was able to transform the economy, I think he's cutting some corners intellectually. He's missing some important points. China is a remarkable country, but it's a country that poses challenges for us and will continue to pose challenges, and it's important to see it as that.
So there are presumably preliminary talks going on now around some kind of a free trade agreement. What does Canada have to know heading into that kind of negotiation?
Well, the first thing to remember is that, and Canadians need to remember this, is that while China is not as important to us as the United States is economically, and may never be that important, it is far more important than everybody else. It's this significant second place. So we have real commercial interests there, and Canadian prosperity is increasingly tied to having a smart and productive relationship with China. If we're going to continue to see our economy grow, we need to be doing business with with the world's second largest economy, and one that is growing faster than just about anybody else. So our traditional interests are in areas like agriculture and minerals and forest products. That will continue, but increasingly we'll be looking at the added value in those dimensions. So forest products and building materials, agricultural products, but new processed foods. When I was in China, I watched as companies like Clearwater Fine Foods of Halifax moved from selling lobster as a commodity, as a block of lobster meat, to lobsters sold in supermarkets with a little sleeve on their claws saying, "From a cold, clean Canadian ocean." And that's an example of moving up the value chain as the tastes and desires of Chinese consumers change. So there's some really interesting prospects for us. We've got to be clear about where our interests are. And we've also got to be thoughtful about what China wants. Increasingly, China wants to sell us food products. China wants to get into the Canadian market in new areas, in areas we may not have thought about them as occupying in the past. So in a free trade agreement, in a free trade negotiation, you've got to be good at getting your point across, but you've got to listen very carefully.
Is listening to the Chinese different than listening to people negotiating trade in other countries?
Well, I'd say with the Chinese, first of all, they're among the world's best negotiators. They sort of invented that art. So you have to be...
They've been doing it for thousands of years.
They've been doing it for thousands of years, and you have to bring your A game. And the other thing about the Chinese, and again, I want to sort of avoid stereotypes, but there is a consistent Chinese approach, is we feel as Canadians that we're good if we've thought 2 steps in advance, so that we've thought about what we want and we've thought about the counter. The Chinese have generally thought 5 or 6 steps in advance, and that's very difficult for us. Generally, a Canadian negotiating position is put together involving the federal government and the provinces and maybe the private sector, and we can hold it together over 1 or 2 passes of a negotiation, but it gets a little shaky and tenuous by the time you're into the 3rd and 4th stages. So it can be very formidable to negotiate against a team China that is absolutely in lockstep every every inch of the process in terms of what they want and what they seek. Their level of preparation and determination is formidable.
You would have experienced this firsthand. How do you bring the whole issue of human rights into that conversation about trade?
Well, I think, first of all, I would look at the conversation as being broader than just about trade. And this is something where Canadians are often in disagreement. And some of the most formidable disagreements I've heard are from Canadians who say, you're unrealistic if you want to raise human rights with China. It's really an example of our sort of conceit, our Western conceit. It's a failure to appreciate a Chinese perspective, and I'd say that's not at all true. I think if you aspire to a mature relationship with another country, of course you want to talk about values and human rights. We talk about that in some respect with all of our partners. So I think it's important to see that broader dimension, that if we, for example, in a commercial negotiation, you assume that the rule of law applies when you're talking about the interrelationship between companies. How can you restrict that to the commercial sphere? Surely the rule of law also applies when it comes to how human beings are treated. So you need to see rule of law as being something that is comprehensive and all of a piece. The other thing that I think is really important, Alison, and I experienced this, I was a public servant and nonpartisan, but one of the problems I think the Conservatives had in their China relationship was they were always very nervously watching Canadian public opinion. And Canadians, I think, are willing to see us engage with China as long as we also indicate that we're willing to talk about human rights. That's important to Canadians. So you get permission to talk about free trade if you're also showing Canadians that you're prepared to talk about other things, and those other things include our values and issues like human rights. The final thing I'd add is this is not just an entirely altruistic exercise. As the world becomes more complicated, more wonderfully complicated, and we have a new generation of people who maybe were born in China but now live in Canada and who return to China, we're seeing increasingly complicated consular cases involving the arrest and detention of people who hold a Canadian passport. So human rights isn't some theoretical exercise, it's often something that's very applicable to the case of individual Canadians. We saw the case, for example, of the missionaries up in northeast China, the Garretts. There are other examples of Canadians who have been imprisoned in ways that cut across our larger concerns about the rule of law. So any relationship with China involves discussions of this nature.
The other piece that's on the table is security. There's been a lot of talk recently about Russian hacking in the United States. We know that the Chinese have hacked government agencies here in Canada as well. How significant a risk is that?
It's a very real risk. It's a real risk right at the level of companies, and this brings us back to the trade discussions. When I was advising Canadian companies, I would say you have to be really, really careful when it comes to your intellectual property. If the secret of your company's success is a patent or is a design that you need to protect absolutely, you might want to think about another market other than China. But if you're a company where you're continually innovating and last year's technology is ultimately irrelevant, then maybe you have a better chance. And if you're structuring a relationship in China, how do you structure it so that it's in your partner's interest not to steal your technology and undermine any prospect of success either one of you has? So technology theft is important at the level of companies and important at the level of countries. And we just need to be aware of that. We need to be much more vigilant and also much more capable when it comes to deterring these cases.
The other security part of it is the whole territorial dispute in the South China Seas. And both China and the United States are flexing their muscle there. It's been described as a global flashpoint, one of the 5 or 6 more serious in the world right now. You've suggested Canada needs to be more present in terms of its Navy. What are you driving at there?
The danger is that, and this is particularly true on the Chinese side, that they see this issue in their territorial seas as a Sino-US issue, a zero-sum game between an American worldview and a Chinese worldview. I think it's in Canada's interest, and I think we're also morally bound to be part of a larger effort that involves other countries like Australia and New Zealand and maybe Singapore to say, we all welcome China's rise. We acknowledge that China is an important country and needs to have a place in the world, and that has necessarily a military dimension, but we also have expectations. Just as we have expectations for countries like the United States, we have expectations for countries like you, China. I don't think that's an overwhelmingly decisive contribution, but it's an important contribution. If China hears that other countries have concerns about occupying islands and blocking trade routes, it may have a more influence than we imagine. If I can add one other security element, the other thing we have to be conscious of is Chinese interference in Canadian affairs. In the past, that involved a mayor or a reeve or an MP or an MPP somewhere in Canada signing on to Falun Gong Day, not knowing that he or she was supporting an organization that the Chinese government considers anathema, but that is really just an organization of culture enthusiasts in China. Increasingly, though, we're seeing the Chinese government interfere with Canadians of Chinese origin, particularly those who come from Tibet or from the Muslim reaches of China's far west, where they may threaten them for political activism in Canada and threaten them through their families back in China. So we need to be aware that while China is very particular about what it calls non-interference in its own affairs, it's not at all squeamish about reaching into Canadian life when it considers that necessary. This isn't something we've really had to deal with in the past, but we need to face up to it as a possibility.
And how does all of that then color trade, which seems to be the driving sort of impetus here in the relationship?
Well, there is sometimes when Canadians think about that, they think of trade as a reward, that if you're a good country, we'll trade with you and we'll do a free trade agreement, but if we don't like you, we won't. What I'm talking about when I posit that we're moving to a new stage in our international relationship is that we increasingly will have to find a way to get along with countries that are very problematic, that do things that we don't like. Does that mean that we should never trade with them or never even talk to them? That was sort of where the Harper government was going with countries like Iran. I'd say that's disastrous for a country like Canada that needs to navigate in a world that has much bigger players. We need to talk to other countries, and we need to do things like trading with them, looking at investment, things that are not at all in any way a threat to Canadian security, and that don't empower other regimes, but in fact encourage them to operate in a more recognizable, in ways that are more in line with the rule of law. So trading doesn't enable China to be more aggressive. If anything, it may encourage China to think about its broader relationships. That said, it's not just about trade. Invariably with China, we do, as I say, have to talk about some of these larger issues, in some ways because rule of law underpins a trading relationship, and also because we're concerned about Canadian values. So Canadians will be concerned about Chinese artists or intellectuals or religious believers who are imprisoned, and we have a right to mention those things. And in part because as China becomes a more influential player, this issue isn't just played out in China. It's not about Canada standing on a soapbox and lecturing China about things that are domestic Chinese concerns, although I think we do get to mention things like that. China is influential enough to challenge very important concepts in the international space. They will say things like the economic development of a country is far more important than its political development, so they will encourage dictators throughout the world to keep on going, to stay close to China and not to worry too much about human rights or issuing in new democratic legislation. We have a stake in contesting this. Look even at Hong Kong. Hong Kong in many ways is a failure for the West because despite all the great promises that were in place at the time that Britain returned Hong Kong to China, Hong Kong is now less democratic than it was. It is much more beholden to China. It is much less distinct than it was. I think we're all poorer when a vibrant society like Hong Kong loses those aspirations. Our links with Hong Kong are many. So we're really impelled, I think we're required to take a look at the bigger picture with China and to keep this dialogue alive that includes things like values and includes things like human rights, not just because of China itself, but because of China's influence in the larger world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.